Lifestyle Finance Collective, where we encourage women to have open and honest conversations about money. Today, we'll continue with our series, which is all about debt. In this episode, we'll be chatting about good versus bad debt. Remember that debt is personal and there are aspects to consider. We're sharing information for educational and conversational purposes only, not specific advice. We're here to share our ideas and what works for us. So let's get into it. Let's break down the idea of debt, whether some debt is good, some is bad, or is it really that there's not one size fits all for debt? Maybe it's more about how you use it and what you're comfortable with. There's a lot of gray areas, aren't there, around debt? So let's dig in and just talk about our perspectives on good or bad, or is it just debt?
It was interesting when we started planning for this episode, and we strategically named it good versus bad debt because that's a lot of the messaging that we tend to hear on websites and in the media. And when we had a conversation about it, we all felt like there isn't just a single way to label debt as good versus bad. So I tend to look at debt as the actual categories. So things like mortgage debt, school loans and education loans, those are debts where you're actually investing in something. So you're investing in a home, or with school debt, you're investing in your future income and improving your skills. And then in terms of debt that can be a little more difficult to carry, it's things like consumer debt. So what ends up on your credit cards, those tend to be the debts that are more challenging and tend to bring a lot more stress for people around how to pay it off. The terms may not be as clear in terms of how you can pay off credit card debt. Then there's just more stress associated with those categories of debt. What do you guys think about the good versus bad label that gets attached to debt?
My assumption is that it's different for different people, right? So some people hear the word bad, and that's not necessarily such a negative connotation for them. They're like, oh yeah, bad things, I avoid those. I don't want to have that kind of debt. Good things, okay, those are safer for me. That's okay. But for other people, like depending on their history and their feelings around the word bad or feeling bad, like it could be a whole different scenario, right? And then there can be all of that like guilt and all of those things that come along with feeling like you're bad or you are a bad person. So I think a lot of it is the way people internalize that word or their like history or experience with feeling bad. Um, I I don't love it for myself. I feel like there's different ways that we could kind of categorize them, and maybe we've landed on these good versus bad because they're two short, simple words that like make two very distinct categories. But I tend to agree with you that I don't think that there's just like, for sure, I don't think all debt is bad. I think we are all on the same page with that. And I do think that there's probably more than two categories of debt, right? There's probably more than just good and bad debt. And we probably need to consider that when we're categorizing things.
Yeah, I would completely agree, because another thing that comes to mind when I think about just debt in general, but then also this idea of good versus bad debt, is what's the interest rate? And I think a lot of times we get stuck on, oh, it's a high interest rate, so it's bad debt. Well, what is your goal, right? Maybe it is if your goal is just to fill up your closet with the best clothes. Maybe you would say, paying 20% on a credit card, that maybe isn't the best debt for you. But what if it's a high interest rate, but it's to buy a property? As an investment, then we start to ask ourselves. So I think a lot of times we get like stuck, like, oh, it's a high interest rate, it's bad, right? But really there's so much more to it, to actually deciding, what are you taking debt for? What, is it a home or is it a new purse? So like you guys said, like, it's definitely not just good or bad. And I think our brain can easily like attach to those things, but I don't know that that's a very healthy way for us to look at it either. Because there's just, it's really part of our financial life of whether we're going to be repaying something and taking debt on it, or if we're going to pay it in full, right?
I often think about time frames when it comes to debt. And I can remember being in my 20s. I had a student loan, and suddenly you get your own place and you have to furnish it. And all of these purchases come at once when you don't necessarily have the income to support it. So there are these time points where you take on more debt. And then traditionally, as you're closer to retirement, that's when people tend to be more cautious and they start to pay down their debt because they don't want to have additional expenses that can change. And the one issue with debt is you can have a low interest rate, and then suddenly rates change and you're paying a lot more of your monthly income towards debt payments. And we've seen that over the last couple of years. And debt can create so much stress because it has an impact on what you have left over for your other lifestyle expenses. So it's definitely been a topic that I keep seeing over and over and over again. And sometimes the debt we end up with is purely for survival. So if you lose a job, you might need to take on some debt temporarily to get you through a difficult period of time. So, one of the key things to start with is if you are feeling any pressure with your debt or you've lost track of what you might have, is taking some time and starting with a debt inventory where you list out the various debts that you have, what the interest rates are, what your payments are, and just start looking at what types of debt they are, and start understanding how that debt arose. So, with a mortgage, that's an easy one. You decided to purchase a home. With credit cards, it can get a little trickier to figure out where that debt came from. So doing a little bit of reflection on, what each of those debts are.
I love that
Agreed.
idea of really just inventorying where you are now, right? And doing that kind of periodically every 6 months or something. Like, how is it going with my debt right now? Does it feel good or bad to me? You mentioned the word feeling. It's about how we feel, right? We need to feel good about our finances to prevent as much stress as we can. So knowing the facts, having taken that inventory, helps us feel either better, or if it makes us feel worse, then we need to do some reevaluation and make a plan of how to get out of that or change some mindset pieces, don't we?
There's two elements of that that I think are so important. One is looking at every single thing, being really honest with yourself. This is just for your eyes to look at. Don't leave something off because you're like, oh, well, that's small. I'll get it paid off later, whatever. Like, just really taking the time to be super honest and writing every single thing down that you owe. And then also doing some, like, having a hard conversation with yourself. Am I justifying some of this spending that I probably is like when I'll speak from my personal experience. When I was using my credit card, there were times when, because I had overextended myself and I had this larger credit card payment now, I was running short on money every month because so much of my income was going to try to pay that down. And so I was then having to use my credit card for the survival things every month because I was paying too much on it. Like, I had gotten myself into this bad cycle. So part of that was me being honest with myself. Do I really need to be charging everything that I'm charging on this card? Does this feel good, or is this debt making me feel more stressed and more overwhelmed? Am I purchasing things that I really don't need, or sometimes even really don't want? It's just in the moment. Sometimes we make those impulsive purchases, or we do spend money to like make ourselves feel better. So I think that part of this inventory is also just really having an honest conversation with yourself about your spending and not trying to justify, but like really being honest and thoughtful about the debt that you lay out in front of you. Some of it, you're going to be like, this is great. I feel really good about this. This was a great decision. And some of it, you're going to be like, you know what? I didn't need that outfit. I didn't need that bag. I didn't need that fancy dinner out. You know what I mean? And you can kind of think your way through it so that you know how to move forward.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And we talked more about repayment of debt in last week's episode. So if you want to go back and listen, we specifically talk about some methods to pay off your debt. So doing that inventory and then making a plan, like you talked about, Jen, of like how you're going to pay it off, but then continuing that process as you're paying it off, right? Do you need to adjust your repayment plan? Or is it working well? Is it helping you control your spending or not, right? Is the situation getting better or in your opinion or worse? So when I think about making a purchase that I would need to go in debt for, so let's shift a little bit from, inventorying what you already have to, okay, I might want to make a purchase that's on a credit card, or I might want to purchase a home and need to get a mortgage. So I have 3 questions that I like to ask before I choose to access debt or not. And they are, does this help me meet my financial goals? What is the interest rate? And then will I be able to make payments in full each month? Or do I need to make a repayment plan for myself? So let's think about like a purchase of a car. So if I needed a car, and I might be considering going in debt to purchase this car, let's apply these 3 questions to that scenario. So does this help me meet my financial goals? Okay, so I have my budget, I have my plan and my goals of where I'm going in the next few years financially. And so I have to ask myself, if I was going to take out a loan to buy a $10,000 or a $20,000 car, does that help me meet my other financial goals? Yes or no, right? What's the interest rate? So if I'm going to buy a $20,000 car at 7% interest, how much is that car really going to cost me? And then what will my payment be each month? Will I be able to pay that in full, or will I just be making a minimum payment on that? By going through those 3 questions with this car scenario, I might come to realize, you know what? I actually can't afford a $20,000 car. Maybe I need to buy a used car off of Craigslist that's more around $10,000, right? Then maybe I could get a loan if I need to make payments, or maybe, I can access some cash somewhere like that. So I like to use those 3 questions if I'm deciding whether I should go into debt for something or not. Have you guys ever thought about those kinds of questions or have something similar that you like to do?
I wanted to point out something that I really liked about your framework is that you looked at the true cost of the purchase. So not just the purchase price, but what it will truly cost with all of the interest factored in. I think that can be a very useful decision-making matrix, because you might feel comfortable paying 30,000 for a vehicle, but when you add the interest and it ends up being 40,000, that may be more than you want to allocate to that item. And that can be the same for even smaller purchases that end up on a credit card, is having a look at when can you realistically pay that off, and how much interest will you accrue to own that item, and is that worth it? So just wanted to, hop in and mention that the true cost is a really great factor.
I think that's what you said is so important. So first of all, I do think about those things, Sybil. When we make purchases, we will often like figure out what we think the payment would be on a debt and then plug it into our budget. And if we're like, no thanks, that makes things too tight, or nope, I'm gonna have to pull money from all these different categories to cover that, and that makes these 3 categories way too tight. We're not comfortable with that. And maybe they're the fun categories, right? And we're like, well, we were putting this much money away every month toward travel, and now we'd only be able to put half. Okay, nope, that's not worth it. So plugging things in like that helps you make the decision, because it, for people who are visual, you can actually see where that money would be coming from. And I think that really helps. A lot of times we, to stick with your car example, we buy cars with our heart and our fun side, right? And we're like, it's going to be so fun to drive this, and the sound system is amazing, and these seats are so comfortable, and all these things, right? And I'm going to look so cute, I'm going to feel so fun driving this. And we're making these decisions with our heart and like how much fun it's going to be. And then when we plug it into the budget, we're like, and put the brakes on. I'm just going to be driving by myself down the street because that's all I'm going to be able to afford. So I think like putting it in there so you can actually see it and visualize it and like feel, what is that amount of money going to do to my month every month, that makes a huge difference. And then backtracking or sideways stepping over to Mary Lee's comment about interest, I think that that is if I would have, like, thinking about credit card debt and just swiping your card to pay for things, to me, that type of debt is not the kind of debt I want to accrue, right? I don't want the debt that I am paying just for things that I want. And if people were to think about in the moment that every single month I don't pay off this sweater, I'm going to pay an additional 25% of interest on this sweater. Sometimes, if your debt goes on forever and you're only paying the minimum payment, you're paying more than the sweater is worth, right? In the end. And I think that that's something that we just wash right out of our minds in the moment, because it's so easy not to think about it because it's not on the receipt. And so I think interest is something really important to consider. I love that you like highlighted that.
Well,
Yeah.
this is where financial literacy is really critical for people to understand, because you're making these decisions that aren't just a today decision. It has an impact on your finances for months and years down the road. So just making sure that you understand what debt you're going into and how that will impact your finances is really it's just really critical to do. And I wanted to mention one other aspect about debt, and that is that debt can also be used as a tool to build your wealth. So I'm nearing 50, and I've definitely had times in my life where debt was used to just purchase things that I needed. And one thing that always stands out for me is buying furniture. Furniture is very expensive when you buy it brand new, and it's not worth very much if you try to resell it. And I definitely had times where I needed to buy things, and I spent a little more than I probably would knowing what I know now. But I've reached this time point where I really use debt strategically to either invest in stocks or to maintain real estate. And then the third area where I'm using debt is also to build my business. So I'll take on some debt strategically if there's something in my business that I think will earn a good return. So debt doesn't like debt. That's where debt can be like just a tool to accelerate the growth of your wealth and your investments. I know that Sybil, you have been using this strategy as well. So I'd love to hear how you apply that in your finances.
Yeah, definitely right now, especially, we're looking to do a house hack. So if you're not familiar with house hacking, the idea is that you purchase a piece of real estate that you can live in and you can rent out part of it at the same time. So we're currently in a rental here. Absolutely love this home. It's an ideal location, and we've lived here for 2 years. And part of our work while living here is to see if this neighborhood is a good place to purchase real estate. Purchasing real estate, obviously, you have to take out a lot of debt to do. So it's scary. but like you said, Marilee, like using it intentionally to build wealth. So wealthy people use debt to build more wealth. It is a tool that you can learn how to use in that way. And so we're looking at ways to, as we wait kind of till the right property comes into play, we're looking at ways that we could use different debt scenarios, or ways that we can take out debt. And so we're looking at like a traditional mortgage, right? A 30-year fixed rate mortgage. We have one of those on another investment property that we already have. We're looking at how can we use our equity from our first property to help us buy a second property. Because equity, the thing about real estate is you tie up a lot of money, right? So we have this equity that's just tied up. We can't use it, but you can. There are ways to take out debt against your equity. So I'm doing a lot of knowledge building right now about different ways that we can use debt to purchase a second piece of real estate that we would live in. So it would reduce our rent by having a renter in the basement in this example with a totally separate entrance, to help pay basically some of our living expenses, because rent or mortgage is your biggest expense for most people each month. So we're trying to learn a lot about that right now, of like what's the best next step for us. And you have to just be willing to take a certain amount of risk. But I know that my spending and paying off debt history is very strong, right? So I've built up enough financial literacy and enough skills and, muscle power to make sure that we can do that before. But it's a really exciting place to be, right? To be able to figure out, like you said, Marilee, put it into your business, put it into real estate. How can I use debt to actually boost our wealth at this point in time? And then the idea would be we would move out of that house and we'd have two rentals, right? And then you always have to have somewhere to live, though. So you always need to be thinking about like, am I paying rent, or am I paying a mortgage for where me and my family are living? But my situation is I have one teenager going to college next year, and then 2 more years my son leaves the house. And so it'll just be my husband and I. So we're also really looking at that longer term. We're not going to need a big family house like this. We're very nomadic. We've lived in 5 different countries. We're used to moving around. I know not everybody feels comfortable with that, but we actually use it as a strategy to build wealth. So, my husband and I will have much smaller needs in the near future. In 2 years, we don't need a big house. Do we want somewhere for our kids to come home to? Of course, but our kids also are used to moving around. And so we're also dreaming up like, where's that family place that the whole family will come to every year? And then they'll bring their families too, right? So debt can be very dynamic, and it can be a tool once you've gotten things into place. So as you can tell, I'm passionate and excited about that. So thanks for asking and bringing it up, Marilee.
You're welcome. And you brought up a really important criteria, which is risk, like your risk tolerance and comfort with debt. Some people are very debt averse, and they do everything to get to a zero debt position. And whereas other people leverage debt and use it to invest. And then, there's the spectrum. So there's no right or wrong, but it is important to know your comfort level, because if there's one thing that keeps you up at night, it's debt.
Right. And like you said, there's no right or wrong, and there's no good or bad, right? This episode's called Good or Bad Debt ? Like, is that a thing? We hear it, but is that a thing? So thank you for listening in today. And remember that we'd love to hear from you. You can comment on the YouTube posts, reach out on social media, send us your thoughts and questions, and be sure to like and subscribe our podcast so you don't miss any episodes. We're looking forward to chatting with you next time.